They said it was madness. They said no sane navy would ever risk carrying it aboard their ships. And so they buried it, the weapon that could have rewritten the entire war at sea, silenced before it ever fired a shot. But history has a cruel way of exposing fear, because what the U.S. Navy once refused was a weapon 16 times deadlier than the one they used every single day. That story begins long before the waves of the Pacific turned red. It begins in a quiet laboratory on the California coast, with one man, a blueprint, and an idea so far ahead of its time, it terrified the people who needed it most. In the winter of 1942, the Pacific Ocean belonged to chaos. American destroyers were being ripped apart by Japanese torpedoes that struck from invisible distances. Submarines vanished beneath boiling white foam. And for the first time in its history, the U.S. Navy realized something unthinkable: their enemy's weapons were better than their own. The Japanese long-lance torpedo was fast, silent, and devastating. It ran on compressed oxygen instead of air, leaving no betraying bubble trail. It could travel almost twice as far and hit twice as hard as anything the Americans had. At Pearl Harbor, at Savo Island, and off Guadalcanal, it cut through American steel like paper. Inside the Navy's own Ordnance Bureau, embarrassment turned to panic. They rushed to fix the problems of their unreliable Mark 14 torpedo, the one American submariners called the Dud. But while admirals argued over paperwork, a quiet engineer named William Hartley was already building the future. Hartley wasn't a commander. He wasn't even a line officer. He was a naval engineer, one of those men who wore grease-stained uniforms and worked 18-hour days in rooms that smelled of fuel and failure. But he had an obsession: efficiency. He believed the only way to beat the Japanese at sea was to outthink them, not outspend them. His idea was simple, yet radical. What if a torpedo could breathe? Not use compressed air, but pure oxygen mixed with a new kind of alcohol fuel that burned hotter, longer, and cleaner. That combination could push a warhead at unheard-of speeds and leave no visible trace behind. When he ran the math, the results looked impossible. A single hit would deliver more than 16 times the energy of the Navy's current torpedo. It was like turning every submarine into a floating artillery gun. The Navy brass called it unsafe. Hartley called it the Mark 16. He and his small team at the Naval Ordnance Lab worked in secret. Day after day they refined valves, seals, and ignition chambers until the device looked less like a bomb and more like a breathing machine. They tested it in shallow tanks, then in the open sea. Each time it performed flawlessly. But every time Hartley sent his data to Washington, the replies were the same: denied. Too volatile. Too risky. The Bureau of Ordnance refused to authorize production. Pure oxygen aboard a submarine, they said, was suicide. Still, Hartley refused to give up. He believed the Navy's fear was costing lives. So one night in 1943, without permission, he took a prototype out to a remote stretch of water near Catalina Island. There, under a moonless sky, his team loaded the weapon into an old test tube and fired. The torpedo vanished beneath the surface, silent as a shadow. Seconds later, a column of water exploded upward with the force of an earthquake. When the spray settled, the rusted target hulk they had aimed at was gone. Not damaged, obliterated. Hartley stared at the empty sea and whispered, 16 times the punch, and they called it unsafe. When his report reached Washington, the reaction wasn't celebration, it was fury. 2 officers from the Bureau arrived within days carrying sealed orders. Cease all unauthorized testing immediately. Every prototype was to be dismantled. Every drawing confiscated. Every scientist gagged by the Official Secrets Act. Hartley was stunned. He demanded to know why. One of the officers looked at him and said quietly, "Because you built something the Navy can't control." The truth was uglier. The Navy's top brass had staked their reputations and their budgets on the Mark 14. Admitting it was obsolete would expose years of bureaucratic incompetence. So rather than risk that humiliation, they buried Hartley's work. The Mark 16 was labeled experimental hazard, do not deploy. By 1944, the Pacific was still a graveyard of steel. American submariners joked bitterly that their torpedoes were safer for the enemy than for themselves. Dozens of missions ended in failure when weapons ran too deep or failed to explode. And yet, the Navy insisted there was nothing wrong. One commander wrote home after losing his target to a dud hit. "We fight with broomsticks while the enemy uses swords. But fate has a cruel way of bringing back buried truths." Late that year, after a disastrous patrol in which 3 submarines were lost, a weary logistics officer named Captain Samuel Denton was sent to review old ordnance files. In a dusty cabinet, behind folders marked "Classified, Do Not Open," he found a set of yellowing photographs, blueprints, test results, oxygen flow charts, and at the bottom, in smudged pencil, one phrase: "A torpedo that breathes like a living thing." Denton knew what he was looking at. He'd seen the results of Japan's oxygen torpedoes firsthand, and he realized America had built one first. They had simply refused to believe in it. Denton took the file straight to Admiral Charles Lockwood, the man who commanded the U.S. submarine force in the Pacific. Lockwood was known for his temper and his hatred of bureaucracy. He had already gone to war with the Navy's own Ordnance Department over the defective Mark 14. When he saw Hartley's notes, he called an emergency meeting behind closed doors. "Gentlemen," he said, "if this weapon works, it changes everything." Within a week, Lockwood authorized an off-the-books test. No paperwork, no witnesses, no reports, just a handful of trusted men, a single prototype reconstructed from Hartley's stolen plans, and one night to prove the impossible. And the man who made it possible never saw it serve. He died in 1953, his name erased from official records, his notebooks stacked neatly in his garage, waiting for history to remember. They called it too dangerous, too unpredictable, too un-American. But the truth was simple. It wasn't fear of danger that killed the Mark 16. It was fear of change. They thought the project was buried for good. They thought the man behind it had been silenced forever. But in war, truth doesn't die, it waits. By 1944, the Pacific was burning. From the black sands of Iwo Jima to the coral reefs of Saipan, American ships moved like a vast steel tide. But beneath that tide lay a deadly weakness, one that every sailor knew but none dared to speak aloud. Their torpedoes still failed. It was a quiet scandal that killed thousands. Sometimes they exploded too early. Sometimes they ran under the target without detonating. And sometimes they simply vanished into the ocean like ghosts. Every failure meant another submarine crew gone, another ship lost, another family receiving a telegram that began with, "We regret to inform you." And for Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the U.S. submarine fleet in the Pacific, that was unacceptable. He'd already buried too many good men. He'd already written too many condolence letters with trembling hands. So one night, under the dim red light of his cabin aboard the USS Tautog, he opened a classified file he wasn't supposed to have. Stamped across the top in fading ink were 2 words, Project Gorgon. Inside, he found a report dated 1932, over a decade old. They towed a captured Japanese freighter out to a test range off Pearl Harbor. The torpedo was armed and launched. Silence. Then, an eruption so violent that even from miles away, the observation ship rocked in its own wake. When the foam cleared, the freighter was gone, split clean in 2. Lockwood stood on deck, his hat in his hand. He didn't say a word for nearly a minute. Then he whispered, "They refused this?" The test confirmed what Hartley had known all along. The weapon worked perfectly. But it also confirmed Lockwood's fear. The higher command would never admit it. If word got out, it would expose not only the failure of the Mark 14 program but years of deliberate cover-ups. So Lockwood made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered the results sealed. Officially, the test never happened. Unofficially, he began pushing for the Mark 16's quiet resurrection under the radar of the bureaucracy. And somewhere in California, the man who had designed it, William Hartley, sat in a tiny workshop, blacklisted, forgotten, and heartbroken. He'd built a weapon that could have changed the war, only to see it buried by the very people he'd tried to protect. He told a friend shortly before leaving the service, maybe they were right. Maybe America isn't afraid of losing. Maybe it's afraid of changing. The Mark 16 would eventually surface again, but too late for the men who needed it most. By the time it entered limited post-war production, thousands of sailors had already been lost to torpedo failures that could have been prevented. Blueprints, notes, equations scribbled in pencil, and a name that history had already forgotten. Commander Arthur Hartley. Lockwood read the first paragraph again and again. A description of a torpedo that used pure oxygen as its propellant. Not compressed air. Not steam. Oxygen. The result? A weapon that could travel nearly 3 times farther, strike twice as fast, and hit with 16 times the power of anything the Navy had ever built. He leaned back, the words echoing in his head. 16 times deadlier. And yet, the Navy had refused it. The report ended with a single line, scrawled by Hartley's hand. If they ever understand what this can do, it'll be too late. Lockwood felt a chill run through him. He knew what that meant. Somewhere in this war, the enemy might already have it. And they did. Across the Pacific, in a dockyard near Kure, Japan, a young engineer named Fukuda Masami stood beside a sleek, silver weapon that looked more like a shark than a torpedo. It was called the Type 93 Long Lance, a direct descendant of the very same concept Hartley had tried to give America. It ran on pure oxygen, silent and deadly, leaving almost no bubble trail. At 48 knots, it could travel over 40 kilometers, striking ships that thought they were safe beyond range. And the Americans had no idea. At the Battle of Savo Island, the Long Lances tore through U.S. cruisers like they were made of paper. For ships gone in minutes. Men drowned, burned, vanished. And while the survivors blamed luck, the truth was far crueler. They were fighting their own lost invention. When reports of these super torpedoes reached Pearl Harbor, Lockwood's suspicions hardened into fury. He gathered his senior staff and slammed Hartley's file onto the table. "Gentlemen," he said, voice low, "we built that weapon. We had it, and we buried it." The room went silent. No one dared respond. Everyone knew what he was implying, that somewhere, someone in the Navy had killed the project. Not because it didn't work, but because it was too dangerous, too new, too uncontrollable. Bureaucracy had triumphed over brilliance, and now American sailors were dying for it. Lockwood made a choice that night. He would resurrect the weapon even if it ended his career. But the path forward wasn't easy. Every door he knocked on slammed shut. Research files were missing. Budgets were closed. Commanders whispered that he was chasing a fantasy. Still, he pressed on. He found one surviving engineer from Hartley's old team, a man named Robert Dwyer, now working in a scrapyard in San Diego. Lockwood sent a coded telegram. "Need expertise on deep oxygen propulsion. Navy business. Confidential." 3 weeks later, Dwyer arrived in Pearl Harbor. Old, limping, coughing from years of breathing metal dust, but his eyes still sharp. When Lockwood showed him the blueprints, Dwyer didn't say a word for a minute. Then he whispered, "I told him they'd steal it." Lockwood frowned. "Steal it?" Dwyer nodded. Hartley's idea didn't die. The Japanese naval attaché in D.C. saw the tests. He asked questions, took notes. Next thing you know, the project's gone, and the paperwork's labeled unstable, terminated. "We buried it. They built it." Lockwood leaned forward. "Can we build it again?" Dwyer smiled faintly. "Admiral, we can build anything. Question is, will they let us fire it?" For the next 6 months, Lockwood ran what he called Operation Ghostfire, a secret experiment hidden from even his own superiors. Under the cover of night, engineers rebuilt the old oxygen propulsion system inside a remote hangar on Ford Island. The design was dangerous. Pure oxygen and kerosene made an explosive combination. One mistake, one leak, and the entire lab could go up in flames. And it almost did. During one midnight test, a valve burst, sending a jet of flame across the room. Men dove for cover, alarms blared, and the hangar filled with smoke. When the fire was finally out, the walls were scorched black. But the torpedo still sat there, humming quietly, pressure gauges steady. It had survived. Lockwood walked up to it, placed his gloved hand on the steel casing and whispered, "You're not going to die again." Weeks later, on a dark July morning, they brought it to sea for the first test. The waves were calm, the horizon painted gray. The torpedo slid into the water, vanishing like a phantom. For 20 long seconds, nothing. Then, a plume of water erupted 2 miles away, followed by a thunderous boom that rolled across the ocean. The blast ripped a practice target clean in half. The crew stood frozen in shock. One sailor muttered, "Holy hell! It's alive." Lockwood didn't celebrate. He just watched the waves ripple outward, his jaw tight, because he knew what came next, convincing Washington to approve something they'd already killed once. He sent a coded message to the Bureau of Ordnance. Prototype successful. Range exceeds 30 kilometers. Oxygen system stable under pressure. Request production clearance. Days passed. No reply. Then one morning, a teletype clattered out a single line. Authorization denied. Program deemed unsafe. Destroy prototypes immediately. Lockwood's blood boiled. He slammed his fist against the console. Unsafe? Men were dying every week because of weapons that didn't even work. That night, he gathered his officers again. They stood in silence as he read the telegram aloud. Then he looked up and said, "Gentlemen, we're done asking for permission." Over the next 2 months, Lockwood's team secretly continued refining the weapon, testing different fuels, balancing oxygen pressure, recalibrating detonation timers. Every success made the risk grow. If Washington found out, he'd be court-martialed. But if he stopped, more sailors would die. He chose to keep going. In October 1944, disaster struck the Japanese fleet at Leyte Gulf, but not from bombs or artillery. Lockwood's submarines had begun using modified prototypes of Hartley's design, hidden behind official Mark 18 designations. The results were devastating. Torpedoes that should have traveled 4,000 yards were suddenly hitting ships at 10,000. Targets that normally survived 2 hits were obliterated in 1. Japanese reports panicked. Their destroyers, once confident, began keeping greater distances. One admiral reportedly said, "The Americans have found our secret. The sea belongs to them now." Lockwood read that report in silence. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply folded the paper, placed it inside Hartley's old file, and whispered, "Rest easy, Commander." They finally listened. But not everyone celebrated. Word spread inside the Navy that Lockwood had violated orders. A formal inquiry was launched. Officers whispered he had gone rogue, risking national security by tampering with unauthorized weapons. When summoned to Washington, he stood before a panel of admirals in a dark oak room. "Did you knowingly continue work on a terminated project?" they asked. Lockwood nodded once. "Yes." "Knowing the consequences?" "Yes." "Why?" He looked each man in the eye and said, "Because my men were dying while you debated memos." Silence filled the room. Then one admiral, older, tired, maybe even ashamed, quietly said, "What did you call the weapon?" Lockwood replied, "Hartley's ghost." The inquiry never went public. Lockwood kept his command. And by war's end, the lessons learned from Hartley's ghost shaped the next generation of American torpedoes. Safer, faster, deadlier. But still, to this day, no one officially admitted that America had built, buried, and then secretly rebuilt the most powerful torpedo of the Second World War. Somewhere in a locked vault in Washington, the original plans still exist. A single page stamped "Confidential, Project Gorgon." And beneath it, in faded ink, the last words Arthur Hartley ever wrote. "If they refuse to see the truth, the ocean will teach them." Admiral Lockwood understood. The ocean doesn't forgive arrogance. And in the Pacific, it took one man's defiance to prove it. The Pacific was calm that morning. Too calm. A pale sun floated above the horizon, casting silver light over a sea that looked almost innocent. But beneath those gentle waves, something waited. Something no one outside a small circle of men was supposed to know existed. They called it Hartley's ghost. A weapon born from brilliance, buried by fear, and resurrected in secret by a man who refused to bow to orders. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood had gambled his entire career on this torpedo. And today that gamble was about to face the ultimate test. The location was classified, a remote stretch of ocean near the Mariana Trench. Only a handful of ships knew why they were there, a single destroyer, 2 observation vessels, and 1 submarine carrying the prototype. No journalists, no paperwork, no permission from Washington. Just one order, handwritten by Lockwood himself. Fire when ready. The men aboard the submarine USS Archerfish were uneasy. They'd heard the rumors that the Admiral was testing a weapon so volatile it could blow them all to the bottom. Oxygen torpedoes were notorious for that. One tiny spark, one faulty valve, and the whole submarine could vanish in an instant. Chief Torpedo Man Frank Mullen checked the seals for the 10th time. His hands shook, not from fear of the enemy, but from fear of what they were about to unleash. "Pressure stable," he whispered, glancing at the gauge. The needle wavered, then steadied. "Admiral says it's safe," someone muttered. Mullen gave a grim smile. "Yeah, well, the ocean don't care what the Admiral says." Above them, on the observation ship USS Denton, Lockwood watched the horizon. His jaw was tight, eyes fixed on the calm water where history would soon be rewritten. He wasn't just testing a weapon. He was testing the Navy's courage to face its own mistakes. At precisely 0700 hours, he raised the signal flag. "Begin test sequence." Below, the order echoed through the submarine. Mullen turned the valve. A hiss filled the torpedo room as pure oxygen flooded the chamber. Invisible, scentless, deadly. Every man held his breath. Then, the launch lever dropped. The torpedo slid forward, a blur of steel disappearing into the dark blue. For a few eternal seconds, there was only silence. Then the sonar operator's voice cut through the tension. "Contact moving. 30 knots. 40, 50. Lockwood's eyes widened. 50 knots. The operator nodded, disbelief in his voice. "It's still accelerating, sir." The observation ships recorded everything. Wake patterns, pressure waves, oxygen flow. And then, at the far end of the range, an eruption tore through the ocean like a volcano. A towering column of water rose hundreds of feet into the air. When it came down, the target hulk, an old battleship stripped for testing, was gone. Not sunk, gone. The explosion had vaporized its midsection. The deck crew broke into stunned cheers, but Lockwood didn't smile. He just whispered to himself, 16 times deadlier, and now I've seen it. The aftershock, though, was worse than anyone expected. The pressure wave slammed into the USS Denton so hard it almost cracked her hull. Windows shattered. Instruments flew off the tables. Men were thrown to the deck as alarms blared. "Report," Lockwood shouted. "Minor flooding in engine room. Bulkhead 2 cracked." Lockwood grabbed the railing as the ship lurched again. He turned to his aide. "If that had been a fleet test, we'd have sunk half our own ships." And in that instant, the danger of what they'd built became horrifyingly clear. The weapon wasn't just powerful, it was unpredictable. It didn't just destroy targets. It reshaped the ocean around them. When they recovered the test footage hours later, the engineers were speechless. The blast radius was more than 10 times what they'd calculated. Even the shockwave traveled farther than expected, strong enough to break hull plates at half a mile distance. It was as if nature itself had turned against them. One report simply read, "Unstable yield. In combat conditions, risk of friendly damage unacceptable." But Lockwood refused to give up. He stared at the wreckage on the horizon, then said quietly, "Every weapon starts out unstable. That's why men like us exist, to make it ready for the men who'll need it." Weeks turned into months. Lockwood's secret team continued testing. Smaller blasts, controlled detonations, revised fuel mixtures. They learned that the oxygen mixture had to be precisely balanced, 1 degree off, and the torpedo either underperformed or exploded prematurely. More than once, they came close to disaster. During one night test, a prototype detonated inside its launch tube before it even left the submarine. The explosion ripped open the bow. 8 men died instantly. The next morning, Lockwood personally visited the surviving crew. They expected an Admiral's speech, something about sacrifice, duty, honor. But Lockwood didn't say any of that. He just stood there, hat in hand, and whispered, "I asked you to trust me, and I failed you." He walked out without another word. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in his cabin, staring at a photo of Commander Hartley, the man whose dream had started all this. Hartley had died believing his invention would save lives. Now it was killing his own countrymen. Lockwood muttered under his breath, "You were right, Arthur." Maybe the world wasn't ready. Back in Washington, rumors had begun to spread. Whispers of unauthorized tests, unrecorded explosions, and missing submarines. One senator demanded an investigation, calling it the most reckless experiment in naval history. The Bureau of Ordnance issued a formal recall order, but Lockwood ignored it. He couldn't stop. Not when he knew how close they were. He ordered one final test. If this one failed, he'd shut the whole thing down himself. The date? March 1945. The place? A deep-water test zone 200 miles east of Guam. The target? A derelict Japanese cruiser captured months earlier. As the sun sank below the horizon, the test team prepared the last prototype. It was the culmination of everything they'd learned. Balanced oxygen flow, redesigned valves, reinforced casings. The engineers called it Gorgon 9. Lockwood just called it the last chance. At 1900 hours, the submarine launched the torpedo. It vanished into the darkness, leaving a faint silver trail that shimmered for only a moment. Then the ocean went still. 5 seconds. 10. 30. A minute. No explosión. Malfunction? One officer asked. Lockwood said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. Then suddenly the sea began to move, not from a blast but from a pulse. The entire surface trembled like something alive was moving beneath it. A deep rumble rolled through the water, and then, boom! The horizon erupted in fire. The explosion wasn't a single flash. It was a chain reaction, detonating the cruiser's remaining fuel and ammunition in a massive fireball that lit the sky like sunrise. Even miles away, the observation ships shook from the force. The radar screens went blank from interference. When the light finally faded, all that remained of the target was a patch of blackened ocean. No debris, no wreckage, nothing. The men stood in stunned silence. Lockwood removed his cap, his voice barely above a whisper. "Gentlemen, that was perfection, but perfection had a price." Hours later, the engineers noticed something strange. Their instruments showed seismic disturbances, not just at the blast site, but across hundreds of miles. The explosion had triggered a chain of underwater tremors, minor, but enough to be detected as far as the Philippines. In other words, they hadn't just tested a torpedo. They'd shaken the ocean floor. Lockwood realized what that meant. If such a weapon were ever used near friendly ships, ports, or reefs, it could cause catastrophic tidal effects. Whole fleets could be wiped out, friend and foe alike. He stood there, staring at the flickering dials, the rumbling data. For the first time in his life, Charles Lockwood felt afraid of his own success. That night, he wrote a letter, not to Washington, not to his superiors, but to himself. It read, "We have built something the ocean itself fears." Hartley dreamed of a perfect weapon. He never imagined it might be too perfect. If history ever learns of this, may it also learn restraint. He locked the letter in his desk, next to the file marked Project Gorgon. 2 days later, he sent a secret order to dismantle the entire test facility. Blueprints destroyed, engines disassembled, all remaining prototypes dumped into the trench. To his officers' confusion, he said only, "Gentlemen, we win this war with courage, not madness." When the war ended later that year, Lockwood retired quietly. No medals for Gorgon, no recognition for Hartley, only silence. The official record showed nothing. No tests, no results, just a few blank pages and a single classified note. The war was over. The guns were silent. The Pacific, once an ocean of fire and blood, was calm again. But the sea remembers everything. every explosion, every secret dropped into its depths. And somewhere beneath those black waters, Project Gorgon still slept. For 30 years, no one spoke its name. The files were sealed, the engineers retired or disappeared. Admiral Charles Lockwood's letter was buried in a Navy vault, unread by human eyes. And the ocean kept its silence. Until 1973. It began like most rediscoveries do, by accident. A survey vessel, USS Hawthorne, was mapping the seafloor near Guam, searching for lost submarines from World War II. Their sonar pinged something strange, metallic, large, perfectly cylindrical. Too clean to be a wreck. Too deep to be natural. At first, they thought it was a lost Japanese torpedo. But when they examined the sonar prints, one technician muttered, "Sir, that shape doesn't match any known weapon. It's huge." Word reached Washington within days. A Navy historian, Dr. Emily Royce, was assigned to identify it. She spent weeks digging through forgotten files, old naval archives, and personal journals. Most had been redacted, but one entry caught her eye. Dated March 1945, signed CL. It read, "All prototypes destroyed. One missing at depth. Coordinates lost during storm." She froze. The coordinates on the file were only a few miles from where USS Hawthorne had found the object. She whispered to herself, but among the men who'd seen it, who'd watched the sea itself ignite, the memory never faded. They spoke of it in whispers, in bars, in lonely shipyards years later. They said it was the day the Navy touched godhood, and then turned away. And maybe that was the right choice, because some power once touched should never be used again. Decades later, a young naval historian sifting through declassified archives stumbled upon a damaged film reel labeled Test Footage, 1945. When he played it, the image was grainy, almost unreadable. But in the final frames, as the explosion consumed the horizon, one faint voice could be heard through the static. "Lockwood, my God! What have we done?" Then the film cut to black. To this day, no one knows where the final surviving prototype went. Some believe it was dumped into the trench. Others say it was quietly recovered by American engineers and studied during the Cold War. Whatever the truth, one thing remains certain. The American Navy once built a weapon 16 times deadlier than anything they used, and they buried it beneath the waves. Because even victory has limits. And sometimes the bravest decision isn't to pull the trigger, but to walk away from the power to end everything. In July 1973, a deep-sea recovery operation began under the codename Blue Harpoon. Officially, it was a naval archaeology mission. Unofficially, it was a race to retrieve a weapon that shouldn't exist. The recovery ship lowered remote submersibles equipped with robotic arms. The images they transmitted back were haunting. A long, sleek torpedo half buried in silt, its hull intact, markings faint but visible. On its side, the letters G9 were barely legible under layers of marine growth. It was real. After all these years, the ocean had kept Lockwood's final creation safe. When the torpedo was brought aboard, engineers surrounded it in awe and dread. It was enormous, longer than any modern torpedo, its propeller assembly unlike anything they'd seen. The fuel ports were still sealed, but the smell of oxidized metal and salt hung heavy in the air. Dr. Royce ran her hand along the corroded hull and said softly, "This thing could rewrite history." A young lieutenant asked, "Ma'am, should we notify the weapons division?" She hesitated. In her mind, she heard the stories of the early Cold War, the nuclear arms race, the push for deadlier, faster, more efficient destruction. If word got out about a torpedo that could shake the ocean floor, what would stop someone from trying to build it again? She made a decision that day. "No official report," she said. "Not yet." They would study it quietly, in secret. The G9 was transported to a naval research facility in Hawaii under heavy security. Even the transport crew didn't know what they were carrying. It was labeled simply, "Experimental Propulsion Unit, Do Not Tamper." Inside the lab, the scientists began their examination. To their shock, many of its components were still functional. The internal oxygen tanks, though corroded, held traces of compressed gas. The wiring, primitive but ingenious, was built for precision ignition. And inside its nose, they found something that made even the senior engineer step back. A secondary detonation chamber. A device designed not just to explode, but to multiply its own shockwave. A self-reinforcing pressure reaction. No wonder it had been 16 times deadlier. The chief scientist, Dr. Harold Evans, was stunned. He stared at the schematics they reconstructed from the wreck. "This design is decades ahead of its time," he said. "The Navy buried a weapon that modern science is only now beginning to understand." Someone whispered, "Maybe they buried it for a reason." Evans didn't reply. For months, they ran simulations, digital recreations of how the Gorgon 9's explosion propagated through water. The results were both mesmerizing and terrifying. The detonation created a hollow sphere in the ocean, vacuum pressure so intense it could crush submarines a mile away. Then, milliseconds later, the sphere collapsed, doubling the shockwave outward. It didn't just destroy ships. It rewrote the laws of underwater physics. Dr. Royce watched the footage of one simulation in silence. When it ended, she turned to Evans. "If this had been used during the war," Evans nodded, "there wouldn't have been a Pacific left." But something else caught their attention, something Lockwood himself might never have realized. Embedded deep inside the torpedo's propulsion unit was a strange alloy. It wasn't standard steel. Tests showed traces of a material that resisted corrosion, pressure, and heat. The metallurgists were baffled. One of them finally said, This isn't just war tech. It's decades ahead of metallurgy from the 1940s. They began to wonder, had Hartley, the original inventor, stumbled upon a formula far beyond his era? Or was it just a lucky accident born from desperation and experimentation? Whatever the case, one thing was clear. The Gorgon was a masterpiece and a curse. As the months passed, tension grew in the research team. Some scientists wanted to publish their findings, believing it would bring recognition and funding. Others feared the consequences. One night, after another heated argument, Dr. Royce called for a meeting. The air was thick with exhaustion and paranoia. She stood at the front of the room, a single classified photo in her hand, the original explosion from 1945. "We are not dealing with history," she said quietly. "We are dealing with a ghost. And if we wake it up again, we might not survive what comes after." Evans sighed. "You think someone will weaponize it again?" She looked at him and said only one word. "Always." Weeks later, the decision was taken out of their hands. Washington had found out. A high-ranking admiral flew in, flanked by intelligence officers. He ordered the lab sealed, the data confiscated, and the torpedo prepared for transport to an undisclosed location. When Dr. Royce protested, he simply said, "This is above your clearance, Doctor. Consider this entire project erased." But that night, she couldn't sleep. The thought of what they were handing back to the military gnawed at her. She knew exactly what would happen next. Reverse engineering, weaponization, escalation. So she made one last desperate choice. Before dawn, she entered the lab one final time. The guards didn't stop her. She still had clearance for a few more hours. She walked straight to the containment chamber where the G9 rested. The torpedo looked almost peaceful, like some ancient beast sleeping under glass. She placed her hand on the cold metal. "You should have stayed in the sea," she whispered. Then she activated the decommissioning sequence. A failsafe Lockwood himself had designed, meant to destroy the weapon's internal systems if recovery was ever attempted. The alarms screamed through the facility. Engineers ran in panic. By the time they reached her, the chamber was already venting superheated steam. The Gorgon's core melted down, flooding the room with blinding white light. When it cleared, the weapon was gone, reduced to molten fragments. Dr. Royce survived, barely, but her career and the secret of Project Gorgon were over. The official report read, "Containment breach, prototype destroyed during transport prep. No viable data recovered." But the truth was far stranger. Some fragments were recovered, pieces of that unidentifiable alloy. And quietly, in laboratories far from the public eye, they began to study it again. Because war never ends. it just changes shape. Years later, Dr. Royce lived in quiet anonymity. She never spoke of what happened, never published her findings. But one night in 1989, she received a letter. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed on an old naval machine. It read, "The sea never forgets, and some things never stay buried. CL." She stared at the initials for a long time. Lockwood had died decades ago, but the message was clear. Someone somewhere still remembered. In 2010, a declassified naval archive revealed fragments of a project labeled Oxygen-Enhanced Propulsion System. The description matched Project Gorgon almost perfectly. And deep within the Pacific, sonar once again detected large metallic shapes where no wrecks should be. Maybe it was just debris. Maybe it was something else. But to those who know the story, one thought remains chilling. Perhaps the ocean didn't keep Gorgon as a secret. Perhaps it kept it safe, waiting. Because the most dangerous weapon isn't the one you build. It's the one you bury, and then forget why you buried it. And somewhere, miles beneath the waves, the silence of the sea still trembles. As if something old, something powerful, is dreaming of the day humanity comes looking again.